The honourable member for Langley-Aldergrove.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honour to be in this House representing my community of Langley-Aldergrove, and this is a very important issue, debate that we have happening today. I just want to do a quick review of how we are involved with this debate today. Here, it was approximately a year ago, February of 2015, the Supreme Court made their ruling that Canadians that are suffering do have access to assisted suicide or euthanasia. And I'm going to use those terms because those are the terms that are used in the Criminal Code of Canada. Terms like death with dignity, medical aid in dying, these are, Mr. Speaker, when you have a physician that is helping somebody in the last days of their life, they're not hastening their death. Palliative care is one of those forms of assistance where you're assisting a person in their last days of their life. And so to call it medical aid in dying, it really doesn't truly capture what we're talking about. When we had town hall meetings, Mr. Speaker, one of the terms that I heard was medically hastened death. I think that's more accurately describing what we're talking about, but I'm going to use the language of the Criminal Code that the Supreme Court says we have to amend, and that is assisted suicide and euthanasia, voluntary euthanasia. Mr. Speaker, when the Supreme Court in February of last year made their decision, and I'm going to be sharing my time, Mr. Speaker, with the incredible member from Abbotsford, that community just to the east of Langley. And Mr. Speaker, incredible because he was probably Canada's greatest foreign trade minister, and he did so much for this country. I just want to thank him for all his work. So, Mr. Speaker, the Supreme Court decision, February of last year, and what did the previous Parliament do? Well, they knew that there was an election coming of October of last year, so they appointed an external panel. The external panel was given a clear mandate to consult with Canadians and then to create a suggested legislative response. After the election, Mr. Speaker, the new government contacted the external panel who had completed their work of consultation and were in the process of creating the legislative response, so that Parliament then the new Parliament could have started right away, because we had until February the 6th to deal with the issue. So what did the new government do? They contacted the external panel and said, we've changed your mandate. We no longer want legislation. We're going to create our own legislation. And instead of Parliament being called back and creating a special committee to deal with that legislation, which would have given us until February the 6th of this year, would have given us a few months to debate that and work on it. The government changed the mandate, said we're going to create our own legislation, and then dithered. For a number of months, dithered, and then created the special committee. The special committee came up with recommendations, and then what did the government do? They dithered and delayed. To the point now, we have 4 sitting weeks to do basically what takes normally 2 years to do in 4 sitting weeks. Mr. Speaker, what Quebec did was 6 years and 3 premiers in non-partisan environment to deal and create with Bill 52 in Quebec, dealing with assisted suicide and euthanasia. And I'd say that they did a much more responsible way of dealing with this. Now, some would say, we wish we did not have this debate. And I heard that when we had town hall meetings. But the Supreme Court in the Carter decision made that decision for Canada and said this must be permitted, and they're counting on Parliament to come up with appropriate safeguards to ensure that we protect vulnerable Canadians. And so what has the new government done? They changed the mandate of the external panel and dithered, and then they had a special panel which is partisan in nature, and they dithered after the report from that. And here we have 4 sitting weeks. First of all, Mr. Speaker, I think it's really disappointing, and I would encourage because of the way the new government has handled this, this is too important that this is rushed through, but this is what they're doing. 4 sitting weeks, and they are not consulting properly. They're not giving Parliament adequate time to do this properly, and they're ramming this through, and it's basically legislation passed by exhaustion. And, Mr. Speaker, we heard in this special joint committee, we heard from Aboriginal communities, 2 of the witnesses representing, and they were not consulted. Mr. Speaker, and that's another requirement of the Supreme Court of Canada, that we consult properly. And, Mr. Speaker, that's not happening with this government. That is not transparent. That is not accountable. And so I would suggest they seriously consider what happens on June 6th if the bill does not pass. What happens in Canada if their mismanagement of this results in no legislation in Canada, and we have this legal void, which Carter decision of Carter takes over, and then you are advocating turning over the responsibility of protecting the vulnerable to each College of Physicians and Surgeons. And you have different policies being applied right across Canada, and it would be a very, very serious situation. So I'm hoping that we will work together, that I would suggest that the government seriously consider asking for some more time for the Supreme Court, because they have not managed this well, and we end up with only 4 sitting weeks left to do 2 years' worth of work. Mr. Speaker, I want to speak to a couple of the changes that I believe that needs to be made in this legislation, C-14. The number one thing that I've heard at town hall meetings, wherever I was in British Columbia or Saskatchewan, at home, is the importance of conscience protection. I had a young nursing student come up to me and said, you know, I don't want to be part of this. Would I have to be part of this? And I said, well, presently, the way the special committee that was formed, they're recommending that, yes, you would have to be, and that physicians would have to provide an effective referral. The legislation C-14 is very silent on this, and they will leave it up to each province to come up with their own policies of how this is going to be dealt with. The Canadian Medical Association said that 70% of physicians in Canada do not want to be part of this. 30% of physicians in Canada will participate in assisted suicide. So it's not an access problem. But what do we do about conscience protection? And so the legislation, C-14, clearly needs to be amended to make it a criminal offense to force, through intimidation, coercion, in any way, threatening a physician that you will not be able to practice medicine, or a nurse, or a pharmacist, any healthcare professional, forcing them to participate in this against their will. And, Mr. Speaker, that's the number one thing we heard time and time again: protect conscience rights. It can be a criminal code is being amended, and it needs to be amended. C-14 needs to be amended to include that type of conscience protection. Without it, you do not have a pan-Canadian approach. You have different policies in each province and territory, potentially. And some provinces have indicated that some physicians must participate. Mr. Speaker, if we go on and do not provide the legislative protection, the charter rights protected, and the Supreme Court says physicians' charter rights should be protected. If we not provide proper conscience protection, Mr. Speaker, I am concerned that we will see in Canada physicians leaving the practice, either retiring, and I have a physician I met with just recently, 71 years old, and he is still practicing medicine because he loves to help people. That young nurse student that I shared about, she wants to leave nursing school, and I says, don't leave yet. Let's see if we can fix this to make sure your conscience is being protected. If we do not protect the conscience rights of Canadians, of physicians, of nurses, of pharmacists, Mr. Speaker, we are going to have people leaving the practice. They're either retiring or they're going to relocate to another jurisdiction where their conscience will be protected. And we already have a shortage of physicians and nurses and doctors in Canada. It will it would create a medical crisis in Canada if we do not protect the conscience rights of Canadians. And it's a charter right, Mr. Speaker. And it's our responsibility to protect the vulnerable and the conscience rights. There is a gaping hole in the legislation in C-14. We need to fix that, Mr. Speaker. And I see a number of members here that are going to be on that Justice Committee, and we're going to be voting as Parliament, and I hope that we can deal with that. Mr. Speaker, do I have any time left? I am out. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.